Africa has witnessed multiple challenges due to its part in the deteriorating state of governance, democratic backsliding, and the spread of terrorism, protracted and emerging conflicts, as well as from the rise of non-traditional security threats. While from since 2020, there have been 9 successful coups on the African continent, with Niger and Gabon being the latest countries to join the expanding list in the year 2023. Following these changes, many African nations have become particularly vulnerable to the effects of a fragmented geopolitical environment, hence stressing the dire need for an engaged community for nations within and without the continent to help advance its growth. It cannot be overstated that the current system has enabled many countries around the globe, like China, to develop, yet the rules have often been skewed against poorer countries, hence a call for reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, today's focus focuses on the role of multilateralism in shaping Africa's future. While we unpack this with our guests, ladies and gentlemen, we say you're welcome. This is Talking Points. Stay with us. It's a pleasure to be in your company, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for trusting us this day. Of course, this is For You Media Africa. And of course, we debut today's edition of Talking Point to focus on the role of multilateralism in shaping Africa's future amidst the growing geopolitical stakes around the globe. And of course, the swift transition from bipolarity to multipolarity. It's worth noting that collaboration is important while shaping the narrative across the globe, and Africa has a role to play. Meanwhile, it should be noted that African heads of state and government have once again called for reforms within the global architecture for Africa's voice to be duly heard. To evoke this topic of discussion this day, I'm being joined all the way from Kenya by AGERE SIGUNGA, who is a representative, a program assistant at TRIBELESS Youth Organization. Thank you immensely for joining us this day.
Thank you so much for the session and having me here. I'm glad to join you on this topic for the day. Yes, on multilateralism, and the role it plays in terms of shaping our nation's future. Yeah.
Exactly, and there is this renewed call where Africans are called upon to collaborate more amongst themselves before getting to the global scene to get their voice heard. We've equally been joined all the way from the United States by Dr. STANLEY, FONGOD, PAN-AFRICANIST, ECONOMIST, and the CEO of Constant FinTech. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. Thank my co-partners for joining in, and thanks our viewers also for tuning in. I pray that we will be having a very fruitful conversation today.
To debut out of Africa, before we focus on the African continent, I'll kickstart with you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, multilateral collaboration or cooperation between countries, be it within the African continent or at the global level, is indispensable in shaping Africa's potential, or better still, unlocking Africa's potential. Now, being a Pan-Africanist as well as an economist, how do you think that this will go a long way in uncovering the voice of the African continent, which African leaders have long earned or yearned for it to be heard at the global stage?
I think the most beautiful thing that comes from a multilateral cooperation when we have talked about multilateralism is the fact that we will be talking about some kind of economic integration and cooperation among countries. And this is essentially powerful, because when you start thinking about economic growth, you have to find ways in which we have the capacity to sell our goods and services to other countries, allow some small to medium-sized enterprises from being able to sell that which they produce to the markets that might be. And there is nothing more powerful to any small to medium-sized enterprise like an open market. And the reason for that is because they're exposed to a larger market share. They have a lot of people who will be interested in their goods and services. And in that regard, they will absolutely reduce costs of production because of the volume of production that they're doing, as they gain more profit by selling their goods to this open market. We have to be able to encourage that. That being said, said, I think that we also need to find ways in which when we start talking about multilateralism and on the global stage, we need to be able to find ways to talk about it in relationship to intra-relation within African countries. We cannot be talking about how well we want to relate with the rest of the world when our own relation that we have among African countries on the continent of Africa, it's not that great. So we must find ways in which we increase African cooperation among African countries rather than talking about having corporations with other foreign entities. And the reason why this is extremely very important is because we have to start finding ways in which we talk about manufacturing on the African continent rather than just shipping out of the continent raw materials. That has not helped any society, it has not helped any nation, and in the case of Africa, we have remained below the poverty line, and this has been Africa's Achilles heel. This has been Africa's problem, that we have remained at the bottom of the economic barrel because we just keep shipping raw materials out. There is no conversion, not even in the areas of cocoa, not in the areas of crude oil, not even timber. We are just, specialized in carrying out every raw material, sending it out there, and then causing other countries to become industrialized, countries like China, and some European countries. Even Brazil is doing a whole lot more better than we are, even as a continent. And the reality is we have to find ways in which we bring in local manufacturing on the continent of Africa so that we can boost up the local economy. And then this huge percentage of unemployed young Africans that we do have, we are able to push them into the marketplace and allow them to participate in the economy, either being employed or starting up their own businesses. And because what that happens is once we have certain areas that get into manufacturing, secondary industries will absolutely emerge as a result of the fact that some form of industrialization has come in, irrespective of whatever field is that we bring that in. For example, when we this is in the tech space, because that's the only thing we can relate with on the continent of Africa. When MTN came along with the cell phone technology, what you realize is a lot of people got into selling credits for MTN, all right? And so a lot of young Africans got employed because they set up this tiny kiosk and they were able to sell credit. And as a result of that, they were not just selling credit for MTN, they were also selling little tiny provisions. And so you had somebody with an idea, which was just the fact that the person started by selling just credit, and soon long after the credit business was no longer that viable because of technology, but then they had the skill sets to be able to set up little tiny supermarkets and little tiny stores as a result of just being able to participate with an onslaught which was on the cell phone communication business. So we have to be able to find ways in which we promote these secondary industries that can actually emerge as a result of what is it that we do so far as having manufacturing on the continent of Africa is concerned. That should be the first line of any kind of a multilateralism cooperation that we have on the continent.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. It's worth noting that African countries have once mentioned that at the global stage, representation was somewhat unfair, which is what you mentioned so far. You noticed that these multilateral institutions have been somewhat favorable to countries, and they have helped in growing others and have been unfair to poorer nations, which we get to see within the African continent. Moving forward with you, AGERE, you listened to what your co-panelists had to say, but looking at the African continent, in as much as African states keep mentioning that there is underrepresentation at the global level in terms of seeing how they can strike a balance in balancing up the benefits of multilateral cooperation, do you believe that how can Africa actually commit to exploring and shaping its own multilateral institutions within the continent. So it starts first by benefiting Africa. Say, for instance, I say we're doing with cooperation between, say, Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria, and a host of others. How can we strengthen our institutions so it benefits first the continent before we are looking at going out there to make our voice heard at the global level?
The way you framed your question, I'd say that Africa, we are playing a big role right now as Africa. We are part and parcel. We are within the table, in the confines of the table. So the only question we always need to ask ourselves is: are we in the table as diners, or are we the meal or the menu in this table? So Africans, in most occasions, we find ourselves in the table as a menu. So having that in mind, we really need to consider so many factors before we delve much into this multilateralism. So there are so many factors that are at play right now. We are experiencing new scramble for Africa. It's more of like during the colonial period, there was the scramble and partition for Africa. But when, you know very well, when colonialism of that dimension, where they used to take slaves and do whatever they wanted within Africa, when it lost its luster, there's so many diabolic means where they retracted and went to rethink on how to govern Africa. That is the conceptual West. So these are also factors that are right now are in play, because we have seen European leaders within the nation where we come, we have seen, they allowed us to elect our leaders. That is the first concept. They allowed us to elect our leaders. They were not even bothered in the process. But then when we elect these leaders, we'll always see the conceptual West send their arrowheads. We've seen emissaries like the Bill Gates coming to greet your president. You've seen the Tony Blairs of the current days, the Emmanuel Macron of the French, come to greet our very African leaders that we've elected. And on that moment, you'll be seeing the issues such as agriculture being brought on the table. You'll be asking, we ask ourselves, if this is agriculture, but then they'll be telling our African presidents that if you want this to be done, then you have to do it this way. If you want us to finance your healthcare program, then you have to do it this way. So why is it that whenever we want to have this kind of a multilateral conversation on the basis of calling each and every community on board, is it that they're doing it to favor Africa, or is it that they're doing it to favor our local nations? So I would like to look at it in a basis of international players who are coming to play in the African context. On what is it that they're always ready to help Africa grow? So that is how I'm going to look at it. We've seen African continental free trade that that is there in the screen, and when you look at it, is it really made in a manner that it will be beneficial to our nation? You see typical ambassadors from European nations treat our head of states with in a condescending manner. Does it mean that when we talk about multilateralism, we have to still hold them in high regard so that they dictate how we run our affairs? That is how I'm going to look at multilateralism. Is it that our state must typically depend on the products that were brought up from abroad to determine how we run our country, or do we have to really rely on them? That is the question that I pose today. Yes, thank you.
Thank you to AGERE SIGUNGA joining us all the way from Kenya. Now, moving forward, Dr. FONGOD, adding up to what your co-panelist said, how can African countries assert their influence? Because he mentioned something about Africans deciding or getting to know if they are on the table or if they are the meal, actually. And Africa has been looking for a point or a seat at the table where it gets to discourse with superpowers, making its own voice heard. But in that light, how do you think Africans can assert that influence which they have to bring about their full potential? Because he even cited the AFCFTA, which is within the African continent, but all African nations are yet to utilize these agreements for the benefit of the continent. How can Africa go about this?
The reality is that Africa is feeding the addiction of the superpower. It's not as if to say the superpower is just, becoming the superpower based upon certain values that the superpower has. No, the African is feeding literally the addiction of the superpower. We are feeding them with oil. We're feeding them with whatever it is that they need to become superpower. Is it our lithium? Is it cobalt? Whatever you can think of. The DRC is making the superpower become more powerful. Unfortunately, the African has not come to the consciousness that she has what it takes to be able to have a conversation with these so-called superpowers with the same level of tenacity that they have when they're speaking to the African. Most often at times when the West wants to talk to the African is shipped out of Africa so that the African can be lectured in Washington, D.C., so that the African can be lectured in London, or the African can be lectured in France. Now, the African also has been lectured in Russia, and the African also was lectured in China. Every now and then, we get shipped as a bloc. 50-something nations get shipped at a bloc, to go and sit down and listen to some non-African tells the African what to do. This is it is a sad situation for the African, and I think that it does not work well with the psyche of young Africans. And this status quo has to change one way or the other. If you look at the kind of cooperation that can happen on the African continent, if you have a country, let's say Ghana, let's say Cote d'Ivoire, two countries with producing close to about 60% or 63-64% of the world's cocoa. All right, every single cocoa produced in the world, from where we have chocolate, is produced in two countries. That is Cote d'Ivoire, and that is Ivory Coast. Cote d'Ivoire, that's Ivory Coast and Ghana. Cote d'Ivoire, it's the, I think it's about 30-something%, and you tie in with what Ghana is producing, that gives us maybe about 63-64%. All right, and that means that we have the capacity to be able to decide what the price of cocoa will be. And as it is, the price of cocoa per ton has been set up at around $400, which is not what used to be, because smaller communities like Hershey, Pennsylvania in the US that produce, that is like the capital hub for chocolate in America. It's in a place in Pennsylvania called Hershey, whose GDP, the area of Hershey is not the size of East Legon in Ghana. It's not the size of Bonneberry in Douala, Cameroon. All right. It is so small. It's called Hershey, Pennsylvania. But they decide the GDP of the whole entire nation of Ivory Coast, and whose GDP per capita is larger than both nations, Ivory Coast and Ghana combined. But it is just a small hub, and all they do is manufacture or convert cocoa beans into chocolate products. This is all they do, which we can also be able to achieve on the African continent if only we got into manufacturing, if only we got into converting most of our raw materials into semi or finished goods, which is something we can do. Let us say we do not have the skill sets to be able to produce some of the finest chocolate in the world. Let's just say that, Swiss chocolate, because of its vantage point, is coming out of Switzerland, or you are having, Hershey chocolate coming out of Hershey, Pennsylvania. If that was going to be the case, we can also be able to ship, instead of sending them just cocoa beans, we can send them cocoa powder or cocoa paste. Right? We can start the manufacturing process in Africa and then ship somewhat semi to finished products to them, rather than just shipping cocoa beans and then taking away from young Africans that is supposed to be employed in this sector. That can be said also concerning petroleum products. If you look at a country like Nigeria, if you look at a country like Angola and Nigeria, they are doing they are producing a lot of oil, crude oil, and as it stands, they are, I think Dangote's refinery in Nigeria is producing close to about 650,000 barrels of petrol daily. That's what the refinery capacity is, which basically reduces to the tune of about 16 billion annually that Nigeria will be importing in relationship to her getting finished petroleum products. We need to find ways in which we rely on Africa producing what we need to consume in Africa. As long as the African relies on everything that comes outside of the African continent, for their livelihood, they have no voice. But the time we need to go to get our voice back is when we start investing in manufacturing on the continent of Africa. I think that's how we start talking about having the kind of corporations that we need. This idea of always talking to the West for what Africa needs to change.
Exactly. Africa needs to start with a change of mindset if it needs to move forward. Now, AGERE, we have seen several fora that have taken place out of the African continent. We're talking of, we've seen the China-Africa Summit, Russia-Africa Summit. We've seen numerous summits that have taken place. And we have seen the announced France Africa, or better still, Africa France summit that is expected to take place in Kenya. Now, away from that, when you look at all this, do you believe that Africa actually has a lot of options on the table?
Africa has a lot of options.
Okay.
And I'd say Africa is always punching below its weight. You've seen in the global market a country with all the natural resources that almost all the nations rely on to be the greatest producer of all the minerals that we need in the world to produce. But then Africa is still suffering and is struggling with so much. Take a look at about a country like maybe Indonesia. The GDP of Indonesia I was checking at it, and it's about 1.1 trillion. Considered all the indices that we use to measure the GDP. But then and it's also among the G20 nations, and as well as the 17th largest economy in the world. But then take a look at a country like Nigeria with at least, to the higher extent, I'd say 500 billion GDP. But then the power generation in Nigeria, if you check out, because we all know that energy is the game changer right now in the whole world. And take a look at Nigeria, which produces about 17 megawatts of power, which is purely hydro. Mostly it's always hydro, because Africa relies on the hydroelectric power.
That is true.
And look, of this 17,000, what goes to the grid is roughly 8,000 megawatts, and that is what the whole country relies on. So, and what about countries like Iran, which produces over 75,000 megawatts and in the power economy? So all these things, does it mean that Africa is not able to do the same as these other nations? We are able to, because we have even to talk about the rivers and all these things. But we really need to put more focus on how we want to change our nation to the best, because these other nations, they got it right. It's through the industrialization that my friend is talking about, my co-panel is talking about. It's through production. But then are we as a nation, are we as an African state producing? We don't really produce. We are barely consumers of these products. However much we do the primary production, where then they go and then we only consume what has been value addition has been done to those products. They go, we import them, we export them, and then what comes back is what we consume at a higher price. So do we really enjoy the products of what we can produce? I believe it's not. So those are challenges that I'd say we experience as a nation. But then for Africa to grow, I'd say that we must first of all start by being able to recognize the domestic weaknesses that we have in in Africa. We have, like, take a look at African Union that currently we have. Who funds this African Union? That is a major question that we always ask ourselves. You'd purely take that 60% of the resources that funds AU is from the international partners. if we are not even able to finance structures that we put in place to govern us or to even establish or be our watchdog when it comes to development, then how will we even grow as a nation? So that forms a big part of the question that we have. And when we go back now to the multilateralism, and when we go back to the multilateralism, we really need, I like the quote of Ronald Reagan that talks about every nation does what is in the best interest of that nation. We as Africa, we have states, small states, about 54 states. But then in these 54 states, there are some that maybe in terms of GDP and all these other, they're not major players in the international market. So what can we do to strengthen this? Lateral negotiations that were brought into our nation, into the nations, after when goods that were brought to us in the purpose of hoodwinking hoodwinking as Africa to create an environment which benefits these foreign companies to the detriment of Africa. You've seen the second-hand goods that came up, and these nations, like mostly the developed nations, had to seek. Now they are going into bilateral negotiations with specific countries. So look at about a country like USA without that GDP making a negotiation with a small country like Rwanda or even Kenya. What exactly are we promoting? But then all these presidents or all these nations will not even want to go to trade with us through our trade blocks that we've created. So for us to come up strongly, we need to really make good use of these economic blocks that we had fronted. We have the East African Community. Remember the SADC that were brought to, that we promoted, or are now players in terms of strengthening the economic blocks. So I believe that for us to, what can we do is exactly strengthen this thing. But then we have to recognize our domestic weaknesses, which majorly goes back to now the leadership of our nations. Yes, thank you.
Exactly, a real sort of reorganization needs to take place, and of course that leads me to the next question. You cited the African Union, and with you, Dr. FONGOD, looking at the African Union as a regional body within the African continent, and from an economic point of view, what role can this regional entity play as a key multilateral player in terms of taking the African continent forward? Because we're looking at the flaws. When you look at the African Union as of now, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We equally have other policies that have been put in place and programs that have been put in place within the African continent, but are yet to get into full fruition. When you look at all these challenges, do you believe that the African Union can actually play that key role it has to as a multilateral player within the continent? And if it's not, what are the parameters that need to be put in place?
I think that I have very limited respect for the African Union. I might be thinking that we might want to focus a little bit on regional integration and have communities on the African continent like ECOWAS or the Eastern African Community speak more to their people than what it is that we have so far as a blanketed approach is concerned for the African. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at a place like Ghana, if you look at countries like Nigeria, Togo, and then you look at all those other landlocked countries that we have, this will be Niger, this will be Mali, Burkina Faso, there is a way in which we have to start thinking about placing railroads. So why don't we start by, we understand that we need to be able to improve our infrastructure on the continent of Africa so that we can reduce cost of production and also be able to transport transmit our goods and carry, to carry our goods from one location, place of manufacturing, to wherever our point of sale will be. We need to be able to do that. And that means if you're going to be able to achieve that, a robust railway system is absolutely needed. The terrain on the African continent is very unforgiving. And the reason for that is just because of the topography, the way the continent is built. We rise rapidly as we leave the sea level, and as you go inland, you climb rapidly, which means that it is not possible for us to be able to have any kind of seaworthy vessel, basically go inland. If you look at something like the Congo River is a series of waterfalls. It is not possible to have any kind of a vessel, all right, to navigate the Congo River. It's just not possible. If you look at the river like the Niger, rather, in Nigeria, that goes through Timbuktu and end up somewhere in northern Liberia, that river, it has been used for centuries, by missionaries, by slavers, people who were transporting slaves and gold upstream to have an exchange point in places like Timbuktu for salt, ivory, and glass, coming in from the Middle East. What we need to be able to do, and that river, as it stands, only operate, within a certain season of the year during the rainy season, because once it gets dry, the river becomes sandy and bigger vessels cannot even go upstream. So you just have smaller boats. What we need is to rely heavily not on river navigation, but we have to rely heavily on railways. And if we were going to build up a robust railway system, it will be important for us to do that region by region and then find ways to interconnect regions to a global continental scale. The only way in which we're able to achieve that is by making sure that regions like the ECOWAS, regions like the East African Community Bloc are able to create their own railway systems. So if somebody was trying to ship something to Niger, either they're sending it to the ports of Nigeria or they're sending it to the ports of Ghana, whichever one they choose, they need to be able to be a way in which we are not going by routes that these containers are able to go through to Niger, to Ivory Coast, to Mali, or Burkina Faso through railway systems. And I think that we really must be able to do this because it reduces the amount of time that this goes on the road, it reduces the cost of transportation, and it boosts up the local economy. If we look around the continent of Africa, only the nations that are at the coast, those are the most prosperous, and those are the countries that have developed the most. Most countries that are inland and most cities that are inland are not as developed, and the reason is because there is something to be said about seaports and development, and it is what has happened across the world. Most continents have waterways within their continent that seaworthy vessels are able to navigate. Not so on the continent of Africa. Those are the challenges we have. It's a curse and a blessing at the same time, because what it means is that most of our resources that are still inland are still inland. They are locked inland, and they are being basically looted out at a lower rate, as opposed to if we were able to just have seaworthy vessels roll into the continent of Africa. The same thing can be said about Cameroon. If you look at Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Central African Republic, all of those countries are landlocked to Cameroon, and that means the seaport either in Kribi or Douala is being used to transport most of their vessels. Why not carry that by train? Why do you have to burden the local Cameroonian, with having all these heavy vessels and equipment on their roads? It can be easily taken through by train, and you realize that those other countries like Central African Republic, Chad, will boost up their economy as a result of the fact that there will be an extension of the seaport right up to their neighborhoods. We need to be able to set this. We need to be able to do this. Something should be said also about energy. Energy is big. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from energy. There is a dam in Ghana called the Akosombo Dam, I think, in the Volta region. That dam was set up by the great Kwame Nkrumah. That dam has not done what it was set out to do, and the reason is because because with the volume of water that that dam is supposed to be receiving is not enough to generate the electricity that Ghana needs. And so you had this massive infrastructure, which building construction is another thing, but then it's just there. It is just like a monument that is basically doing nothing. We have to start thinking about protecting our environment by making sure that we get into alternative sources of energy, which Africa has enough land space to be able, landmass to be able to do that. The whole of the Sahara, all right, the whole of the Sahel, it should be a belt that is teeming with solar energy plates, and we should be able to find ways in which we can use, either we're using geothermal, we're using heat like we use in some areas of California to be able to generate electricity. We have to be able to find ways in which we do that, because the energy sector is as important as anything else. Without energy, there is no way we can be talking about manufacturing. In all of our talk about industrialization, in all of our talk about how we really want to be able to bring in manufacturing and bring in companies, if a country like Nigeria is depending on generators, all right, to create her electricity, then if you're talking about bringing in manufacturing, the country will be in trouble. I mean, it's sincere trouble. But we need the manufacturing, we need industrialization, so we have to find ways in which we understand about energy, bringing alternative sources of energy, not just relying on the hydroelectric power system, but basically creating other forms of energy on the continent of Africa using latest technology so that we can be able to generate electricity that we need. And that means that other areas might be favorable in generating this electricity. For example, there are waterfalls in places like Cameroon that has the capacity to generate electricity, that will support Nigeria. We need to be able to tap and harness those in those areas and forget about all the political issues that we might be facing, but try as much as we can to look at it from a broader perspective as far as the continent is concerned. If a country like Cameroon was going to harness her energy capacity, then she will be able to sell that energy to countries like Nigeria, boosting up the local economy as well, building infrastructure, bringing about a lot of development, to the local people. We must be able to improve on the energy sector.
Indeed, we should improve on the energy sector. I recall that just a few days ago we saw a meeting, or better still an agreement between Uganda, the president of Uganda, the Central African Republic, in a bid to see how they can boost infrastructure development, especially in the transport sector between the countries, to see how they could create some sort of link with countries within the East African community. And equally, just on Sunday, we saw the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, that went ahead to inaugurate a new train station in the country, which the government of Ministry of Transport estimates that come 2030, the country should be able to be transporting some 2 million people. Now, away from that, when you look at all this, Dr. FONGOD, I'm staying with you. When you look at all these limitations that do exist as far as boosting this sector on the African continent is concerned, do you believe that there are some mechanisms that need to be put in place for Africa to harness its potential and, of course, enhance or foster production within the continent of Africa so it gets to take the continent to where it wants to be?
I think that there's something that should be said so far as creating some kind of a standardization on the continent of Africa is concerned across different domains, so that we seamlessly are able to interconnect with one another without having any issues. For example, if you look at any electronic component that is being created, there is some kind of a standard that is set for just about the charging port. Recently, if you've have any of the latest iPhones, you realize that the iPhone charging model that they had, which was quite uniquely iPhone, is no longer the thing. Everybody is with the USB-C, which is more of an Android thing, because we are trying to create some kind of a standard, and that what that also means is that it's environmentally friendly, so that whether you're using an iPhone or you're using an Android phone, you don't have to be wondering exactly how you're going to charge it, because anyone with the charging port, so far as they can charge a phone, will be able to help you charge your system. I think that creating some kind of a standard on the continent of Africa, and that's something that the AU should focus on. And what that will do is that it will help the African and help different African countries to be able to interconnect with one another. Recently on this program, we were talking about the fact that it is absolutely quite difficult to be able to have a railway system that will go across different countries. That simply means we cannot just connect Cameroon to Nigeria or Nigeria to another country so far as the railway systems are concerned, because most likely the tracks are different, and the track size is based upon whoever our colonial masters was. So whoever was your colonial master, they brought in the track system that was theirs. They had since moved out of that space and created something that will allow them to be able to communicate, across, for example, in Europe, with each other. Unfortunately for us on the African continent, whatever they gave us is what we are still holding on to, and that has brought the pain and the nightmare that we have. We need to be able to create some kind of a standard that states that if you're going to build a railway, system, this is the standard. And the reason why we must have that standard is because then we can be able to communicate with another. If you're going to build a road, any kind of an international highway system across the continent of Africa, or your own highway system in your individual countries, it must be this length, it must measure this width, and it must have this certain traffic laws, so that if somebody was driving from Ghana, by the time they got into a place like Kenya, there's no ambiguity in relationship to road signs. We all know exactly what it is. We must create that standard across the continent of Africa, and that is the way it's going to help us to be able to seamlessly integrate with one another. I think that is the biggest issues that we're having. When I talk about the railway tracks and roads, this goes across even in areas of specialization on skill sets. If somebody is a medical doctor, there needs to be some kind of a standard exam across the continent of Africa that if you pass that exam, you can be hired anywhere on the continent of Africa, and there will be no ambiguity in relationship to whether you are competent enough to be able to function in that capacity. This should also go in relationship to our laws. This has to go in relationship to our CPAs, anyone who has to do with any kind of taxation, anyone who is going to be working in engineering. There has to be some kind of a standard. The Western world has this. I don't know exactly why we do not have this approach on the continent of Africa. We must be able to make sure that if you are going to exit any university on the African continent, there has to be an exam that you take that basically qualifies you to be able to work anywhere that you want to work on the continent of Africa, because that means we understand that you're competent enough to be able to do so. And for us to be able to achieve that level of competence, that also means that our university circles must be able to come across one broader accreditation system where what they are teaching the students mirror matches whatever it is that the system says that they're supposed to know. So that you don't have a school that is teaching something else, maybe lower and not as good as other schools in terms of the knowledge that they are giving out to these students, and then they're still expected to write this particular standard of examination, and they're expected to pass. That will be totally unfair. We need to be able to create some kind of an accrediting system on the continent of Africa that accreditates all of our universities and our school systems, and allow us to be able to compete and emerge and have an Africa where students are not just learning garbage, but they are fully being educated. You cannot just get up and say, I'm trying to start up a school. It's like business in Africa. Everyone owns a school, but the reality is, what is the accreditation? What standards are you being held to? There must be a standard in which we hold our educational systems to, and that can only happen when there's an accrediting board. So that, to me, is some of the issues that we need to be able to address, and this will come as a result of us on the continent of Africa understanding that we must be able to set up some kind of a standardization across the board, irrespective of the space, irrespective of the field of interest, irrespective of the area in which anyone is operating in. Agriculture, mining, it does not matter. There has to be a standard, a mode of operation that everyone follows across the board.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD, for your brilliant insight. And of course, that leads me to the next question with you, AGERE. Now, AGERE, you listened to the point of view of your co-panelists, which is imperative at this point in time when we're seeing a transition within the African continent. But then, away from that, when you look at partnerships within the continent of Africa, Africa is being told, like your co-panelist stated, should be able to cooperate and, of course, have some sort of synchronization in the way things are done within the continent, so it doesn't vary from country to country. Now, in that same regard, when you look at countries or partnerships that will exist within Africa and African countries, or Africa and the rest of the world, do you believe that these kind of partnerships can actually go a long way in fostering multilateral cooperation?
Yes, as my past, as he has put it, there's that need for collaboration. And for us to have this collaboration, the first question that I insist we need to ask ourselves is that we must define how we engage with the whole world first. We have our weaknesses as nations. We were separated into small entities of about 54, and that one may even limit how we engage with other nations. We really need to come together because, as he puts it, there's so much that the nations abroad have achieved, the European Union have achieved, because when you move from one nation to another, when it comes to the transport system, is as easy as just moving from one nation to another, because the road transport is okay. But now the major issue that we have right now, even in era of take that for an example. One nation, like right now, we are using, all of us are using internet, and there's need for communication for a nation to prosper. For Africa in a continent like Africa with 54 nations, we are struggling to have these 55 telephone access codes. When you purely go to Nigeria, I guess they use the 230 plus 234. Kenya is 254. Zimbabwe, I guess, is 263. Tanzania is always 255 plus 255. And all these telephone calls, it makes communication so much intense and heavy on us. It makes it so hard on us because we really need to communicate for us to grow as a nation. So there's that kind of a symphony that we really need to do. Institutions like African Union that have been brought, why can't Africa have maybe just one satellite when it comes to communication from just across the board? Why can't we develop infrastructure? But then we also need to ask ourselves, while developing all these infrastructures within these nations, we have this agenda 2063 that was brought that we developed, and the agenda 63, we know it's talking. It has 7 pillars, about 7 pillars. Well, we have the climate change. We talks about the health, research and science. Another pillar is on the arts and culture, democracy and governance. And all these pillars, we really need to be keen on them, because when you talk about development, some nations, like even here in Kenya right now, we have the standard gauge railway. Standard gauge railway is trying to ease the flow of the railways between Kenya. You can go to Uganda and Tanzania. They use the same, almost like the same brand or the same size, the same standard that makes it easy to flow or communicate from one nation to another. But then what befalls these programs is all about corruption. Corruption is the evil that is making all these good ideas and good projects that we have to go down. In Kenya, we talk in terms of it was supposed to be developed in terms of using 110 billion, but then right now, if you go on the record, is about 300 billion that was used, but then it has not even reached its destination. So where is the rest of this money going to? When we have nations like Ethiopia, which are developing electric train at even a cheaper cost than these are the one that we are using, the one that was developed in Kenya recently by the Chinese. So corruption is killing our development and all these great agendas that we have on board. But then we also have different interferences. From the diplomatically through the, the gunboat diplomacies, and those are factors that are weakening the basis upon which Africa wants to realize its potential. We see the interference, or economical interference with the infrastructures that we really have to be keen on. When we talk about dollarization, well, we have this dollarization, and then those are instruments that are running the whole world right now. But then Africa was not part and parcel of it. Do we really need to come up with common unified policies that will govern us, that will be able to run this nation to a seamless, to run this continent to achieve its purpose? So I believe that there's much that we need to do. And Africa needs to sit down and rethink on the strategies that they've laid out. Yes.
To decipher the way forward. Staying with you, AGERE, now we've seen the role of African multilateralism in the new agenda for peace. Now let's look at the security aspect of it. With geopolitical tensions on the rise at the global level, there is a call for concern on the place in which Africa, the continent of Africa, finds itself. Now, at that level, what would you say, in your own perspective, is the role of African multilateralism in shaping the new agenda for peace for the benefit of the African continent?
In realization of peace, peace is a major issue when it comes to trade. Like right now, you'd like to do trade with any other nation, Uganda, Nigeria, or all these nations. But then the main issue that is affecting all these nations is insecurity. Democratic Republic of Congo is the major, or one of the largest producer of minerals. But then what is really happening there when we have all these tensions? And to some extent, we always believe that the wars or the insecurity that is happening there is not just, it's somehow kind of funded, or people having different intentions with that nation, so that it does not develop to its potential. Neocolonization is alive and well, and I'd really say that all these infrastructures that we are using currently, even right now, we all know that they are drawn from maybe a specific nation, or one nation to another, be it European Union or the Americans or all those other nations. Some of this interference that we have, even these organizations, and this, when it comes to war, when a nation is having issues, and then we tend to rely on the West, depending on how we want to grow or develop. They are the people who we are told also finances this insecurity, and thus it destabilizes this nation. So meaning that Africa is being governed, but then the people who are also whom we are relying on or collaborating with sometimes may not have good interest on whatever is going to come out as a product. Look at Libya. Libya, nationally, everybody knew Libya, where it was when it was about to even realize its potential. But then what happens to Libya after they've lost their leader back then? Look at countries like Sudan and Ethiopia. When a nation is trying to do better, you'll realize that there are also some centrifugal forces that are trying to pull it apart. Exactly. And then we realize that there are also the international bodies who are at play when it comes to that. We have a lot of tension. We have even the coups that are currently happening. Military juntas taking place in the Sahel region that is currently battling a lot. And remember, even the colonizers, the post-colonizers. Well,
The network seems to be breaking. SIGUNGA, hopefully it's going to stabilize so we get back in touch with you. Now, moving forward with you, Dr. FONGOD, we stay in line with the security situation on the African continent, in line with the new agenda for peace, which is in line with what I asked your co-panelists. Now, given that we have on the African continent the African Peace and Security Council, which is an architecture within the African Union, would aim to see how to address some of the key issues on security across the African continent, which as of now we have Egypt, which is at the helm of that council. When you look at this architecture, Within the African continent, how would you assess multilateral responses to conflict and security crises within this continent of Africa?
We find this kind of a collaboration on the continent of Africa, because then it means we can be able to share intelligence, and also give the support that is needed in areas that they might be finding it difficult to protect themselves, especially in this area of Islamic terrorism. We have to be able to make sure that we are a little bit more closer than we have been in the past, so that intelligence gathering, intelligence sharing should be top priority to prevent any kind of attack, to prevent destabilization in our regions. And I think this is absolutely unnecessary. That means also that we must come we must become of age and come to a place where we fully understand that corruption absolutely has no place so far as a robust society on the continent of Africa is concerned. For some strange reason, we have celebrated corruption on the continent of Africa, and it's as if to say the hero of the day is the most corrupt of us all. If you look at a country like China, in the last decade, they have executed about 5 top either political or economic folks in that country as a result of corruption. So there is a death penalty if you are a corrupt individual in China, and there is absolutely no question about it, and nobody spend any time trying to negotiate or discuss anything with you. I think that we need to be able to bring this kind of an approach onto the continent of Africa, which means that we must be able to let everyone who is in power understand that if you really want to stay in power, you have to sign certain agreements, and those agreements will mean that in the event that you have been found guilty in court legitimately stealing public funds, the only place will not be Krikri in Nigeria, Kundenge in Yaoundé, or God knows where. The only place for you will actually be the mortuary. You will be taken to the mortuary. You may call this jungle justice all you want, but the issue is there has to be a deterrent that makes sense. There has to be a deterrent that stands out. I think that those boys in China, figured this thing out a long time ago. And if you look at the rate of corruption in China, it is nowhere close to anything else that is happening on the African continent. We are corrupt so far as Africa is concerned. And we have celebrated corruption on the African continent that has become more of a career. There are more corrupt people in politics in Africa than you'll find anywhere else in the world. We are specialized in corruption. As a matter of fact, it looks like we all went to school. It's like most of our politicians went to a school that they taught them how to be corrupt before they ever taught them about policy making or taught them anything about governance. We have to be able to make sure that we fight this. Corruption is evil. It has no place in Africa. It has no place in a robust society. And the only way for us to be able to have any kind of a meaningful collaboration across the continent, either be it in security, be it in energy, be it in agriculture, is when this particular element, this Achilles heel called corruption, is taken out of the equation. As long as there's a component of corruption in this equation, all of the gains we make will all disappear within an hour. Once there is a corrupt individual in the space, we must make sure that we do not allow this to happen. That is anti-progress. It does not help the African in any way. All the other things that we can do on the continent of Africa will be meaningful as long as this particular component is taken out. We can relate perfectly with one group relating to another, one sector relating to another. We can have this seamless, interaction that will boost trade, boost economic development. We need to be able to just make sure that it is fair, that it is balanced, that everyone basically is a win-win situation for all countries and all parties involved, and that the only way this happens if folks are truthful. So we must be able to stem out and fight corruption. I don't think of any other thing else as important as making sure that we have a corrupt-less society.
Indeed, if we have to move forward, we need to start from there. Now, taking you to another aspect with you, AGERE SIGUNGA, you listened to your co-panelists who reiterated the need for Africa to address this issue of corruption if the country or the continent intends to move forward. Now, in that regard, how can it be supported through other multilateral tools within the continent of Africa? We're looking at institutions like partnerships and looking at the policies that are put in place within the continent of Africa. Do you think that they are favorable to achieve this goal? And of course, if there aren't, what other parameters or measures could be put in place to ensure that this dies down if Africa needs to actually build that continent it wants to get or wants to be?
It's a possibility. Africa itself, we have to really get to understand where we belong. We have to create a sense of belonging, and that is generally a work of our leaders. That is not, now it gets us to the topic of the leadership and the governance structures that we have in this nation. Our nations nowadays tend to make us believe like we have to depend on other foreign entities to run our programs, so that this corruption, because now they've been overwhelmed by corruptions and all these issues, now they want to entrust other institutions internationally to come and govern our institutions. And it's so sad, like for a country like right now in Kenya, you've heard, maybe you've heard of Adani. Adani is an international conglomerate that is an international player that is currently being given a chance to run our international airport, like the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, the power, that is Kenya Power and Lighting Company. So they are going to take over the energy sector. Of right now, they're introducing at least over 95 billion, injecting 95 billion into our economy. But then we really know of how these corporates have been mismanaging resources abroad, and yet they want to make us believe that the governments cannot do this work. You've seen if you go to different nations out here, you'd find that they're trying to give almost all the state agencies now to the parastatals to run them. But then, is it now that they are not able to do their work? Do we have somebody who must now run their nation so that it grows? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Because if you look at these conglomerates, like the Adanis with a white man on the background, a white face on the background, I'm not making this statement to sound racist, but then it's a white face, but then it's predominantly, you know very well that however much it continues to insist in this nation, then it means that there's a black face behind it. So meaning that our leaders are the one who are now robbing this nation through proxies, like such conglomerates. So those are questions that we really need to ask ourselves. Corruption is so much deeply embedded into our institutions, into our systems, and as well as the geopolitics that is running, that is taking a chance in our economies. You've seen each and every moment right now, the world banks are here all over our neck. We have the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which are playing big roles in our economy. And when they get into the economies like our countries, they'll be the one now trying to advise us on which course of action to take. They've been running, let's say, almost all sectors. When you go to even our education systems, they are the people who go through our universities and advise that you need to have this person in that education system so that we run. So however much we are trying to create that kind of a symphony from learning from the rest, or from learning from developed nations, but then there are some things that we are introducing and are still not even going to be beneficial to our nation, because our leaders lack, they're not interested in how our nation is going to be in the near future, so long as it serves their interests first. However much nations abroad are operating on the basis of the interest of the nation comes first, but then to our leaders it's about my stomach comes first before the nation. That is where we miss it as Africans. And leadership forms the basis or the core of our institutions. We allow ourselves to be exploited so much because of even how invulnerable we are. But then what if we come together? That is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Read about 6 62 years ago, Kwame Nkrumah's speech, who was trying to warn us that if we are not united, they are going to interfere militarily, economically, be it even in our agriculture, the health sectors. Today. And right now we are able to see how they even fast in developing or coming up with military operations or putting up structures, bases, military bases purely in Africa. Go to any country right now, at least you'll find that there is a military, a Western military that base within your nation. And however much is it for just purposely for the security? We are better off than all these things, but then you'll still find that there are people who create these terrorist groups, and then to do an operation, and then now come to claim that there is insecurity in our region. Now they're also the solution to these problems. You've seen even the kind of diseases that our nations are facing, like Ebola, be it COVID. COVID, we all know that purely it was not an African problem, but then the people who create this thing identify a market. As long as they have identified their market, then they make it go viral, and then they're the first people to offer response. They always come at the first call to offer response. So do we really need to trust in these nations? But then how can we also, as Africa, develop ourselves to be able to be a potential player in the international market? Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. But we are going. I feel like Africa, we are on the right track with this agenda to 2063. If we find it right, if we develop geared towards achieving it, then Africa is going to be far much better. When you talk about these policies that we are trying to come up with, I feel like we, as Africa, we still have a lot of issues with that, because Africa, more so even, I'd say even like for our countries, we are the best at coming up with policies, but then now fulfilling them is the issue. We have the Maputo declarations that here in Africa. Has it even become to a realization? We have Malaba Declaration, Yamoussoukro declarations, and we are coming up with so many declarations. Until right now, we are making even these international forums or platforms to be like more of a platform just to mimic or to just attend these things for formality. And then whatever declarations we come up with, we don't really implement them. So we believe that, I tend to buy into the idea that we as Africans need to strengthen our institutions first. And also stating that, for example, like we have these African development banks, which we all know the shareholding, generally you consider there are so many international players that are the shareholders of that bank of about 60% internationally, yet Africa may only be able to achieve 40% of it. So how do we expect to grow as a nation if we are not the people who are getting something out of all these things? We need to be considerate of the fact that we need to care on the basis that corruption is bedeviling our nation and the kind of leadership that we have, so that we need to focus on what exactly do we need to make these nations succeed. So it's all about leadership and governance as a structure, and any other thing that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you too, Sigunga. Now, Dr. FONGOD, is your assessment in line with your co-panelists?
Absolutely. And I think that we really must be able to find ways in which we have a little bit more of meaning, especially with the level of pain that the African is going through. There is, and I am so much in line with what my co-panelist said in relationship to all these agendas that we keep having and declarations and God knows what. 10 years ago, there was I think it came around 2010, there was this game on Facebook that somebody got me involved in. I think it was called Cityville. Cityville was a game where you basically built this virtual city, and it was layer by layer. You started off by just a foundation, you arrange up the city and every single thing else, and then eventually it became this very robust metro cosmopolitan area. Build a city like New York. all right, or a city like Los Angeles, or God knows what you could find, London, or Accra, Ghana, whatever. But the problem was that it was all virtual. So you spend hours, all right, sitting there, and then you're building this, you're wasting your time constructing these mega structures, and how be it you're doing it virtually. I think that is where all of our agendas do exist. We exist in a video game. All the things that the African wants to do so far as our leadership is concerned is locked up in a video game. We are basically in a simulation, all right? So we do whatever it is that we're doing. It's nothing else but a computer simulation. We are going nowhere. We've been nowhere, and absolutely have this fantasy of agendas like Agenda 2063, which means nothing, arbitrarily, is absolutely just pure trash so far as I'm concerned, because everything we say we want to achieve, we cannot be talking about achieving it at an arbitrary date without absolutely showing the gains we are making now. Why 53? What is it precisely that we're doing in the moment that is shaping us for, Agenda 2063? Absolutely nothing. If you went over to somebody, you met someone who was building a house, and the person kept showing you drawings, about this massive building that they want to put up, and they tell you that they're going to put up this structure in 10 years. It's been 9 years now, and they keep telling you about this project that they have to do, in the next 10 years. So every single time they push the ball forward, they push the benchmark forward, all right? And so, okay, you know what? Don't worry about it. We're just going to, at this particular time, we're going to make that happen. They have not bought the land. All right, there's absolutely no architect have looked at the structure. They don't even have a full-fledged understanding of how the structure looks like, but they know that it has to be a massive structure. It has to be beautiful, with all the chandeliers and beautiful dolls and marbles and whatnot. It's in their mind that that's what they want to achieve, but there is absolutely no commitment to paper as to what it will take to be able to build up that structure. It is nothing else but pure fantasy. It's a video game, and I think that that's what we are locked on so far as our leadership on the continent of Africa is concerned. We must be able to make sure that we have gains on the continent that is meaningful. Obviously, there is no government in this world that I know of that has the capacity to create money. They don't just have the capacity to become profitable. When I say create money, I'm not talking about printing it like most governments do. I'm just talking about the fact that they can actually make a profit. No government has the capacity of making a profit because they don't run like businesses. They actually runs like NGOs. They run like non-profit organizations. That's how most government runs. So the idea that you're going to have a government that will be able to create money, create a robust environment where the economy grows, they do not just know how to do that. And that's why most governments have intense difficulty in doing so. Secondly, if you have people who have been educated in the in the academic space to be able to do what they do and understand economic terms and principles, that also does not translate to whatever is happening in the market. You need to have people who basically live and die in the market to be able to help build and structure the different government agencies and what is it that they're trying to achieve. And that's why I'm also a big time proponent of a para-governmental organization where you have people who have the skill set in the economic field, who have done it before, but they can actually just partner with the government to make it better. For example, if you've shown up in a place like Cameroon, you will realize that our passport systems in countries like in a place like Cameroon is actually more of a para-governmental stuff. It used to be that when the government ran it alone, it would take God knows, maybe almost 5 months for you to get a passport in Cameroon. You have to pay someone about 500,000 because the CFA francs, because it was corrupt. It was corruption enshrined in corruption. As a matter of fact, the corruption had its own corruption. That's how intensely corrupt the system was. But when a para-governmental organization came in whose mandate was to produce as many passports as they can because they get a commission out of that, guess what happened? Everything was streamlined, it's digital, corruption disappears. 100 and something thousand, you have your passport. That's the beauty of having a para-governmental organization where everything is basically digitalized, and that's where we go with this, because if you look in most most countries, they basically will run away from having any kind of a digital system. They will basically say, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I will just not be in that space. I don't want to have a digital structure because then everybody can see what I'm doing. If we have a paragovernmental structure in most of the sectors that the government do not have the capacity to do, if they had that particular capacity, they would have done so early on. If they had that particular capacity, this would have happened a long time ago. Unfortunately, they don't have that particular capacity. So we must be able to rely with people or on people who have the capacity to be able to push us to the next level. That means we must create those partnerships. Now, secondly, these partnerships also cannot be created in a vacuum. You cannot have an organization like that which my co-panelist was talking about that is laced with corruption. You cannot have that particular organization shows up on the African continent just because you have a Caucasian face in the background and think that whatever is white somehow turns out to be good. That is lunacy. That is a foolish talk. That is madness. I have seen situations on the African continent where an African shows up with the competence to do what is it that the African has the capacity to do, and they'll tell the African, please don't talk to us because we don't think you have what it takes. The African leaves Africa, goes and pick up someone on the streets in America who is homeless, or in Europe who is homeless, clean the person up, get the person, gives him a suit, and then he has a presidential carpet rolled out to him, not knowing that it is a homeless white Caucasian who has just shown up at any of our presidencies and is talking to some of our people like he knows what he's talking about, and he is nothing else but an actor. Why? Because you have Africans who are so demented that believes that when a Caucasian shows up, that means Jesus Christ is around, or someone with godlike qualities have basically shown up on the scene. This is colonial thinking. This is stupidity at its highest order. We have to make sure that we give Africans their dues. Africans that are competent in the skill sets that they have been trained in, that's what we need to do. Caucasians are hiring Africans to run most of the most complex systems around the world in the areas of healthcare, science and technology. Just look at the West. You will see Africans. You will see Africans running them. There are Nigerians that occupy almost all the top companies around the world. Nigerians. But then when you show up in Nigeria, there's really nothing to write home about. The infrastructures in the continent is nothing to write home about because there are corrupt politicians who sit in power and believe that except somebody shows up with white skin, the person does not have any kind of competence. I don't know exactly where that came from, but I think that is the residue left over, with the colonial era structures that we have had on the continent of Africa. I want us to fully understand that the African has whatever it takes for her to be the best that she can be. Let us employ Africans to solve African problems. The salvation of the continent is not offshore, it's onshore. Africans have the skill sets to help us emerge out of this dark age and also prepare us to be able to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century. I think this is time for Africans to take the helm to run Africa, not importing some Caucasian from somewhere because they just have white skin. That in itself is not helpful to young Africans.
Exactly, the time for action is now. Africa needs to take its own destiny into his hands. Like you stated, it's time for Africa to, of course, bring about African solutions to African problems. Now, to wrap up today's edition of Talking Points, I would conclude with you, AGERE SIGUNGA. Now, you listen to your co-panelists in a bit to conclude today's conversation. What is your way forward for the African continent as it strives to create a safe path for its own future? Just in some 1 minute, so we can conclude.
Yes, I'd say that we have a lot to do as a nation, as Africa. We need to reflect on ourselves as Africans, and we really need to ensure that we strengthen these organizations that we've brought forward to be able to negotiate for Africa to be able to negotiate on an international market, and that will help us define who we are. We really need to take we have to be players in the geopolitical world right now, and we must not run or shun away from it. That there are people who pull the strings, and we wait there watching. We are not like puppets who behaves like a mobilized muppets in this political scenes. And we also need to check on our international economic infrastructure or the architecture. When it comes to the de-dollarizations, we have right now the G20s, and we all know the BRICS. And where do we play, or where are we as Africans, or we are the people who will be still on the menu. Thank you for the session, and we will engage more.
Thank you so much, AGERE SIGUNGA, Programs Assistant at TRIBELESS Youth Organization, who joined us all the way from Kenya. It was a pleasure having you in today's edition. Meanwhile, I will equally say thank you so much, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your participation in today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. Thank my co-panelists for joining us as well. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, we should bear in mind that independence on the African continent would debut with economic independence. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. I'll say thank you for your keen attention, and I'll leave you in company of our numerous programs. Bye-bye.